Okay, so today we'll be looking at the HSC Biology 2019 paper, and we'll be looking at question 1 through to 10. So our first question is going to be, which of the following is an example of a non-infectious disease? So this is a pretty nice question to start out with. So our answer is going to be D. So we know that a virus, bacterium, and a fungus are all going to be infectious diseases, not non-infectious diseases. Therefore, hemophilia caused by a gene mutation is the only disease that's non-infectious, and this is actually going to be a hereditary disease. So hemophilia is when you don't have the ability to clot your own blood. So patients will lack a coagulation factor, and this is going to be a sex-linked disorder. And as you can see, it's actually going to affect males and females. Okay, so this is a 1-star difficulty question. So in question 2, what we're looking at is how the body responds to a vaccine. So what this question is going to be identifying which of the following is a response. So the reason antibodies is the answer is because they're made by our B cells. So antigens is actually what our body is going to respond to. So they're going to be a foreign compound. And antibiotics are just a method to treat a disease. So you might give antibiotics to someone who's got a bacterial infection. It's nothing to do with vaccines. And option D is actually just going to be a distractor. So our body has an adaptive immune response, and this is actually what's creating a response to a vaccine. So when you're given a vaccine, you're going to have B cells, which will produce antibodies. So this is a 1-star difficulty question from module 7. Okay, so with question 3, we're looking at birds feeding on a population of beetles over time. So some things to take note when you look at this is it an open or closed population? Are there any new mutations popping up? So are we seeing any variation from a dark colored beetle and a light colored beetle? And you might also like to look at what the bird is eating each time. So when we do this question, the answer is going to be D. So it's an environmental pressure. So the bird's acting as a selective pressure. We know it's not going to be a mutation since there's a reduction in genetic diversity. We're not seeing more genetic diversity coming about. Additionally, we know it's not gene flow because there's no genes moving into and out of the population. This appears to be a closed population. And finally, it's not genetic drift because there's no random fluctuations in the population that we can see. It's followed this real linear 4, 3, 2, 1. You can see each time the bird is actually eating a black beetle. So this is an example of an environmental pressure. This is a 2-star difficulty question from module 5. Okay, so for question 4, what we're looking at is a nucleotide. So nucleotides contain a nuclear base, a sugar, a ribose in this case, and depending on DNA or RNA, we'll see an OH present or not present. And that's going to determine whether it's deoxy or just normal ribose. And here we can see that there's a phosphate. So a nucleotide is composed of these 3 units, and they form RNA and DNA. So our answer is D. And that's a 2-star difficulty. So for question 5, what we're looking at is which of the following is a part of the innate immune response. So inside our innate immune response, we have to determine, first of all, that innate means we're kind of born with it. An immune response is how we're responding to a pathogen. Okay, so the answer is going to be B. Essentially, we know option A isn't correct, and that's because it's a part of the adaptive immune response, not our innate immune response. So antibodies come about from previously being exposed to an infectious disease. Additionally, we know it's not going to be stomach acid, and that's because it doesn't respond to an infection. It is innate and it's there, which kills most of the microbes we consume in our food. Next, we know it's not going to be lymphocytes. So lymphocytes are a part of what our B and T cells travel through. So it's more of an adaptive immune system component. Technically, it's a part of our lymphatic system. So that leaves us with phagocytes. So these are innate immune cells that are able to ingest pathogens, and examples of these are dendritic cells and macrophages. So this question gets a 3-star difficulty rating, and it's from module 7. The next up, we're looking at how the cochlear implant assists people with severe hearing loss. So for this question, you have to actually have an understanding of how the cochlear implant works. So essentially what the cochlear implant does is it will stimulate the auditory nerve. So we know it's not going to be any of these. So with the cochlear implant, you have an internal implant. So what that means is on the outside, we are able to essentially have a way of sensing the sound, and using sound processors, that sound we hear is then going to be transferred up into an internal implant, which will then send an electrical signal through here, bypassing your eardrum. And what it's going to do is be implanted inside the cochlea, and it's actually going to be stimulating the auditory nerve. So this requires surgery to install, and yeah. So this is a 2-star difficulty question from module 6. Okay, so our next question is going to be looking at 2 types of bacteria, and these were isolated from a patient's throat and grown in pure culture. So here we've got bacteria species A, and here bacteria species B. And basically what we want to do is determine which one of the 4 blobs you can see is the most appropriate type of antibiotic to be prescribed for the patient to help them with their sore throat. So in this case, you have to look at the blobs and determine which one has the largest area in all of these 4 cases compared to between bacteria. So you can see the most suitable would be antibiotic W. And essentially the reason for that is it's got the biggest ring in both of the cases. So antibiotic Z has a small ring and a big one, and X is the same. So it's small here and big here. So it would only be effective against bacteria A or bacteria B. Same with Y, except Y's got a smaller ring than W. So bacteria A and B will both be killed by antibiotic W. That's our answer. So this is a 3-star difficulty rating, and it's a module 7 question. Okay, so next we've got a question which wants us to represent data. So what's important is that you actually go through and highlight what they want you to do. So we know this is not continuous data for the different species. And essentially what you want to look at is the animal species diversity over an area. So instantly we can cross out option A and D. And that's because they're looking at number of animals, not the number of animal species. So you might only have a couple animal species and only many animals within those species. So that leaves us with B or C. So the answer is going to be B, and that's because it's suitable to use this for these sorts of variables. So they're qualitative on the x-axis and quantitative on the y-axis. So we're not looking at a rate of change, which is what you see in C when you use a line graph. So a bar chart is what you'd use here. So this is a 2-star question. That's basically a skills question. Okay, so for question 9, what we're looking at is a advantage for animals using internal fertilization rather than external fertilization. So this is a real common question, and you might also see it in the short answer questions. So for this, we know the answer is going to be A, and that's because it prevents dehydration of gametes. So internal fertilization will typically be done on land, and external fertilization is more something you'd see in water. Salmon being an example of water-based external fertilization. So the reason it's not going to be B, C, or D is because firstly, B involves a large number of gametes. So that's an example of external fertilization. You can think of humans, there's not going to be many gametes each time someone is pregnant. Option C, it relies on an adaptation such as a mating ritual. That's actually more of a disadvantage because there's an energy cost associated with that. And there's also going to be a mating ritual for external fertilization as well. And finally, it allows gametes to combine to form unique offspring. Well, that's the case for both internal and external reproduction. So whilst genetic diversity is a benefit, it's not specific for internal. So that leaves us just with A. So this question gets a 2.5 star rating, and it's from module 5. So our final question for today is looking at a group of islands, and these islands have been separated by a large stretch of water. So this basically quarantines the two islands and gives us a good thing to kind of compare between them. So each island has its own policy on quarantining, and there's a nearby country that's experiencing an outbreak. So this is for cattle, and it's an infectious disease. So what we're seeing is an investigation will be done to determine which of the two islands has a better quarantine policy. And they want you to determine which is most effective. So I'd say we'd probably measure effectiveness by the number of cattle. Well, the less effective it is, the more cattle you'll see die. So our question is, which of the following would be a suitable design feature for the investigation? So the answer is going to be C. And the reason for that is for option A, the control is the smallest island. That's not the control. Like, so the smallest island isn't really, that's just a distractive option. For option B, the control is the number of infected cattle. We'd more use the number of infected cattle as our dependent variable. So it's how we determine how effective the policy is. So the independent variable, or the thing we're changing between the two, is going to be the quarantine policy. So that's why option C is correct. And as we already said, the number of infected cattle is our dependent variable. Okay, so that gets a 3-star rating due to it being a mixture of module 7 and skills. And here's the answer key for the 2019 HSC multiple choice question.